The map of North America, as the Pentagon understands it, just fundamentally broke. For over half a century, the United States military has treated its northern border as an invisible administrative line. When the Department of Defense needed to move troops, heavy armor, or critical missile defense logistics from the lower 48 states to the strategic frontier of Alaska, they simply drove them up the Alaska Highway. It was an arrangement built on absolute, unquestioned trust, a geographic guarantee that the Canadian land bridge was always open for American national security operations. But this morning, that land bridge was violently pulled up. Just moments ago, the geopolitical standoff between Washington and Ottawa escalated from a bitter trade dispute into a full-blown continental security crisis. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken the unprecedented, historically staggering step of formally denying diplomatic and transit clearance for a series of major U.S. military logistics convoys. As we speak, miles of heavy transport vehicles reportedly carrying vital defense infrastructure and munitions bound for joint bases in the Arctic are physically frozen at border crossings from the Pacific Northwest to the Midwest. They have been denied entry. The integrated defense grid of North America is, for the first time since the Second World War, physically blocked by Canadian authorities. The reaction out of the White House has been explosive. President Trump is reportedly furious, viewing this not just as an escalation of the ongoing tariff war, but as a direct, unacceptable threat to American military readiness. The administration had assumed that no matter how heated the economic rhetoric became, Ottawa would never dare touch the sacred rail of NORAD and joint military logistics. They assumed wrong. Prime Minister Carney has explicitly weaponized Canada's geography, sending a chilling message to the Oval Office. If the United States insists on suffocating the Canadian economy with punitive tariffs, the United States military will no longer enjoy the privilege of Canadian territory. The immediate global significance of this blockade is terrifying. This is no longer a debate over the price of aluminum or lumber. This is a severe military logistics crisis that cuts off the primary land route the Pentagon relies on to supply its northernmost strategic outposts that are critical for monitoring Russian and Chinese activities in the Arctic. By halting these convoys, Canada has exposed a glaring foundational vulnerability in the American defense posture. The unified shield of North America is fracturing in real time, and adversarial capitals around the globe are watching a historic American vulnerability suddenly laid bare. This crisis is mutating faster than anyone in Washington anticipated, moving from the stock market directly to the military supply chain. To stay informed on how this unprecedented standoff will unfold and exactly how it will impact global security and your daily life, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We are tracking the movements at the border and the diplomatic fallout minute by minute. Hit the bell icon to ensure you do not miss our critical breaking updates as this geopolitical earthquake continues to develop. To understand the sheer, breathtaking audacity of this blockade, you have to rewind the geographic clock to 1942. Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States realized it had a massive, glaring vulnerability. The vast, unprotected frontier of Alaska. To protect the northern flank from Imperial Japanese forces, American military engineers and Canadian authorities jointly forged the Alaska Highway, a grueling 1,500-mile logistical artery carved straight through the wilderness of British Columbia and the Yukon. For over 80 years, that highway has functioned as the unbreakable physical spine of North American defense. It was the ultimate enduring symbol that when it came to national security, the border between the United States and Canada simply did not exist. But that historical guarantee began to violently erode the moment Donald Trump returned to the Oval Office with a fundamentally transactional, zero-sum view of American alliances. The timeline of this continental collapse is a masterclass in executive miscalculation. Started months ago with the White House's insistence on a crushing, punitive 25% universal baseline tariff on all Canadian goods. Ottawa politely protested, citing decades of deeply integrated supply chains and mutual defense pacts. Washington ignored them, viewing Canadian compliance not as a partnership, but as an inevitable law of geopolitical gravity. Over the past 6 months, the friction systematically escalated from trade irritants to structural economic warfare. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a globally connected, highly analytical technocrat who the West Wing fatally underestimated, stopped asking for exemptions and began quietly rewiring Canada's trade networks toward Europe and the Indo-Pacific. When Carney recently issued his open warning, threatening to choke off critical minerals and energy exports if the tariffs were not lifted, the White House largely dismissed it. They assumed Ottawa would never actually pull the trigger on a measure that would inflict severe economic pain on itself. But Washington made a catastrophic error in its risk assessment. They assumed the conflict would remain strictly confined to the economic theater. 30 days ago, operating under standard operational procedure, U.S. defense officials notified Ottawa of an upcoming logistical surge. Convoys carrying heavy armor, advanced radar components, and guided munitions scheduled to transit overland to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. It was a routine notification, a bureaucratic rubber stamp that had been seamlessly approved thousands of times before across multiple administrations. What the Pentagon did not anticipate was that Carney would identify this specific routine logistical pipeline as his ultimate point of leverage. 14 days ago, Canadian diplomats quietly warned their American counterparts that until the tariff war was de-escalated, Canada could no longer guarantee the security and administrative facilitation of U.S. military assets on its sovereign soil. Washington arrogantly interpreted this as an empty diplomatic bluff. They were wrong. Exactly 48 hours ago, the massive transport convoys departed bases in Washington state and Montana, rolling steadily north. And this morning, they hit a bureaucratic and physical brick wall at the border. By weaponizing the Alaska Highway, Mark Carney has taken a bitter trade dispute and transformed it into a live operational hostage situation. He has shattered the sacred, unspoken rule of the American-Canadian alliance. You can fight over lumber, you can fight over steel, but you never, ever touch the military supply lines. The anatomy of this morning's border crisis is as chilling as it is unprecedented. At exactly 0300 hours Eastern Time, the lead vehicles of two massive United States military logistics convoys approached the primary commercial border crossings, one at Sweetgrass, Montana, and the other at Blaine, Washington. Under normal circumstances, the U.S. transport commanders would hand over their classified transit manifests to the Canadian Border Services Agency, receive a perfunctory salute, and begin the long, heavily paved trek north toward Alaska. But today, the boom gates stayed down. According to situational reports now leaking from U.S. Northern Command, Canadian customs officers, flanked by heavily armed tactical units of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, approached the lead American vehicles. They did not draw their weapons, but they delivered a cold, bureaucratic death blow to the convoy's mission. The American commanders were handed formal notices of denial. The manifests were rejected. The convoys were ordered to turn around and park on the American side of the border. Within minutes, frantic calls were bouncing from the frozen asphalt of Montana directly to the Situation Room at the Pentagon. The competing narratives emerging from this unprecedented standoff are completely irreconcilable. Side A, the White House and the Department of Defense, is treating this as a borderline hostile act. According to furiously drafted statements from the West Wing, the Trump administration claims Canada is deliberately sabotaging the joint aerospace defense of North America. The Pentagon's official line is that these blocked flatbed trucks are carrying essential radar arrays and interceptor missile components bound for Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. By halting them, Washington argues, Prime Minister Carney is explicitly violating decades of NATO transit protocols and directly endangering the United States' ability to monitor Russian and Chinese military activity in the Arctic. President Trump is reportedly demanding an immediate, forceful response to what he views as illegal extortion. Side B, the Canadian government, is countering with a brilliantly cynical, legally airtight defense. Ottawa is not declaring a military blockade. They are declaring an administrative impossibility. Carney's cabinet claims that because the United States has unilaterally imposed a hostile 25% universal tariff on the Canadian economy, the Canadian government has been forced into emergency financial restructuring. Their argument? Canada simply no longer has the federal resources, sovereign capacity, or domestic security personnel required to safely escort and monitor thousands of tons of foreign military hardware across its territory. It is a polite, bureaucratic excuse masking a lethal geopolitical weapon. The hard evidence heavily supports Ottawa's premeditation. Commercial satellite imagery captured this morning shows miles of American flatbed trucks carrying tarp-covered military hardware idling helplessly on the interstates of Washington and Montana. But more alarmingly, classified intelligence reports currently circulating in Washington indicate that Canada quietly surged specialized RCMP tactical units to these specific border crossings a full 48 hours before the convoys even arrived. This was not a spontaneous customs dispute. It was a meticulously planned ambush. The terrifying uncertainty hanging over the Pentagon right now is what happens next. If the convoys are ordered to force their way through where we are no longer talking about a trade war. We are talking about an active physical standoff between the armed forces of the United States and Canada. To grasp the sheer terrifying magnitude of what just happened at the border, you have to strip away the political theater and look closely at the physical map of the North American continent. This is not a dispute over trade deficits or softwood lumber. This is a battle over the foundational architecture of the United States military machine. By explicitly dropping the boom gates on American military convoys, Prime Minister Mark Carney has triggered a tectonic shift in the strategic balance of the hemisphere. He has targeted the single most vulnerable geographic choke point in the American defense grid. For nearly a century, American geopolitical dominance has relied on one unquestioned reality. The United States commands a unified, impenetrable North American fortress. And the crown jewel of that fortress, the primary shield against nuclear and conventional threats from Russia and China, is Alaska. Alaska is home to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, the advanced F-35 fighter squadrons at Eielson Air Force Base, and the critical ground-based mid-course defense interceptors at Fort Greely. It is the absolute, undisputed Arctic vanguard of the American empire. But there is a glaring geographic catch to that vanguard. It is completely disconnected from the lower 48 states. The Pentagon's entire operational model for supplying that fortress with heavy armor, Patriot missile batteries, and massive radar components assumes a secure, uninterrupted overland flow through the Canadian landmass via the Alaska Highway. When Carney's government denied those transit manifests this morning, they did not just delay a few trucks in Montana and Washington state. They announced the operational decoupling of the North American defense supply chain. The strategic and infrastructural importance of this blockade is absolute. You cannot rapidly fly heavy armored brigades or massive infrastructure payloads into Fairbanks. Transporting them by sea through the Gulf of Alaska is agonizingly slow, deeply expensive, and highly vulnerable to adversarial tracking. The United States military requires that overland route to maintain its baseline combat readiness in the Arctic. By choking it off, Canada has essentially severed the physical supply lines to America's northernmost flank. The operational implications for both sides are staggering. For Canada, the era of quiet geographic compliance is officially dead. Carney is proving that sovereignty is not just a diplomatic buzzword. It is a physical geographic reality. He is demonstrating that if Washington intends to wage an economic war of attrition via 25% tariffs, Ottawa controls the actual terrain that the American military must traverse to defend itself. It is a terrifying realization for the Pentagon. The United States is geographically dependent on a nation it is currently trying to bankrupt. For the United States, this represents an immediate 5-alarm strategic nightmare. The unified shield of NORAD requires seamless, high-trust integration. If the White House cannot move its own defense assets to its own bases without triggering a diplomatic hostage crisis with its closest neighbor, the deterrent power of the United States military is fundamentally compromised. This clash reshapes the global strategic picture overnight. Washington has spent years posturing against near-peer adversaries in the Pacific and Eastern Europe. But Carney's unprecedented blockade proves that the most immediate, crippling threat to American military logistics isn't half a world away. It is sitting right across the northern border. According to deeply sourced intelligence assessments circulating within the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency this morning, Prime Minister Mark Carney's blockade is not just a diplomatic crisis. It is being viewed as a catastrophic, systemic intelligence failure. Internal memos flashing across the desks of the Joint Chiefs of Staff reportedly suggest that the United States intelligence apparatus was completely blind to Ottawa's willingness to touch the third rail of North American security. The consensus inside the intelligence community is stark. Washington's threat models assumed Canada would retaliate against the 25% tariffs with reciprocal taxes on agriculture or steel. They never modeled a scenario where the Canadian government would physically sever the Alaska Highway. Experts at major international security institutes say the implications of this miscalculation are staggering. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, warn that Washington is now facing an unprecedented Monroe Doctrine collapse. For generations, the foundational premise of American defense statecraft has been that the geographic footprint of North America is fundamentally an extension of the United States' own security perimeter. But scholars are now pointing to this border standoff as the definitive end of that era. By successfully barricading U.S. military assets, Canada has provided a live, highly visible blueprint for other Western allies. American military access is no longer a blank check, and it can be revoked if Washington weaponizes its economic power. Military logisticians are particularly alarmed by the immediate practical defense implications of Carney's maneuver. According to supply chain specialists consulting for U.S. Northern Command, the historical assumption of a permanent open land bridge to Alaska has just been completely invalidated. Analysts are quickly pointing out the brutal logistical math. Airlifting heavy mechanized brigades, Patriot missile batteries, or massive radar components to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson is astronomically expensive and severely limits payload weight. Alternatively, moving these massive assets by sea through the treacherous waters of the Gulf of Alaska is agonizingly slow and exposes critical American hardware to Russian submarine tracking in the Pacific. The Alaska Highway was the only secure, high-volume overland artery. Without it, the Pentagon is effectively trying to supply an island fortress. Academic and policy experts warn that the psychological damage to the global alliance structure may be irreversible, regardless of how this specific standoff is resolved. Leading geopolitical scholars point out that the entire framework of global American deterrence relies on the perception of unbreakable homeland unity. If the United States cannot maintain basic military transit rights through its closest neighbor and NORAD partner, adversarial capitals are taking note. The unified warning echoing through Washington's foremost think tanks this morning is devastatingly simple. By launching a ruthless economic tariff war against a vital, geographically critical ally, the White House has inadvertently handed Beijing and Moscow a strategic victory they could never have achieved on their own, the physical fracturing of the American defense grid. But the other side has a point. To view this purely as a triumphant David and Goliath story, where a righteous, brilliant Canadian technocrat outmaneuvers a blustering American administration, is to completely ignore the brutal underlying math of hard power. From the perspective of seasoned defense strategists and realist geopolitical analysts, the White House might be temporarily embarrassed by this logistical ambush, but Ottawa may have just committed an act of catastrophic overreach. We must first address the intense, undeniable political motivations driving Ottawa right now. Prime Minister Mark Carney may be projecting the image of an unyielding defender of the liberal international order, but he is also a politician managing a fragile domestic electorate staring down the barrel of an induced recession. Any seasoned political strategist will tell you there is no faster, more historically reliable way to unite a panicked Canadian public than to visibly and loudly stand up to an aggressive American president. Skeptics and veteran diplomats argue that this military blockade is a highly calculated, desperate piece of political theater. By framing himself as the sole protector of Canadian sovereignty, Carney effectively neutralizes his conservative opposition at home, weaponizing anti-American sentiment to mask the severe economic pain his citizens are about to endure. Furthermore, the most glaring counterargument to Ottawa's posturing is anchored in cold military reality. Despite the immediate shock of the closed border, the United States military is not a fragile entity that simply collapses when a highway is shut down. Defense logisticians point out that while the Alaska Highway is the most cost-effective and efficient route, the Pentagon possesses the most massive and capable air and sea lift commands on the planet. U.S. Transportation Command, TRAN-ANSCOM, can and absolutely will bypass Canada entirely if deemed essential for national survival. It will cost billions of dollars, and it will be aggravatingly inefficient. But the United States military will not be starved out of its own Arctic fortress. Realist scholars warn that Carney's Highwire Act is profoundly dangerous because it fundamentally misunderstands the White House's threshold for escalation. By touching the absolute third rail of American national security, Canada has handed the president the ultimate justification to drop the hammer. U.S. defense hawks are already arguing that if Canada chooses to behave like a hostile transit state, the United States should legally and economically treat it like one. The opposing view suggests that Carney is playing a game of geopolitical chicken while holding a massive structural disadvantage. If the Trump administration escalates by invoking sweeping national emergency powers, completely sealing the commercial border, or weaponizing the U.S. dollar against the Canadian banking sector, Ottawa's leverage evaporates overnight. The American gamble is that Carney's military blockade will eventually collapse under its own weight, and that the sheer crushing gravity of the United States retaliatory power will inevitably force Canada back into compliance, overriding the defiance we saw at the border today.